girls, it's me, Mrs. Edom. We're back in my dining room again this Sunday, which means that none of us are at church again. But I hope that a lot of you were able to watch my Sunday school lesson from last week. And the thing I loved was your parents sending me pictures of you guys watching it. So I know some of you watched it in your kitchen on a laptop, and others of you watched it in your basements on big screens, and my kids just watched it on my phone. So you can watch our Sunday school lesson anywhere that you are. So I'm kind of thinking about you right now as I'm teaching, wondering where you're watching our Sunday school lesson from today. Now, if you wait until the very end of the lesson, I'm going to show you a secret about my dining room, but you have to wait until the very end of the lesson. Before we begin teaching my lesson from the Bible today, I want to teach you a word. Now, some of you may already know this word, but to others of you, this word may be a new word. The word I want to teach you is, oh, it's going to look backwards, isn't it? Well, it's a word called empathy. And empathy means the ability to understand and share in the feelings of someone else. Now, when a good reader reads a story, whether the story is true, like the stories in the Bible, or the story is a make-believe story, if you want to understand the story better, you have to understand the feelings of the characters in the story. And that's called empathy. So, before we begin our lesson, I want to ask you a question. I want you to think of something that you have, that you own, that is very important to you. Something that you treasure very much. I'm going to give you a minute, and if there's someone watching the lesson with you, I want you to tell them what it is that you treasure. Now, I want you to think for just a minute about whatever it is you're thinking about that you treasure, that you love, and why it is that you treasure that thing. And while you're thinking about it, I asked my kids, and I'm going to show you some things that my own kids treasure and love. The first one I want to show you is, this is Fred. Fred belongs to Xander. Xander made Fred at Build-A-Bear when he was 2 years old. And Xander has lots of stuffed animals, all my kids do, but Fred is his special stuffed animal. And usually if Xander spends the night at his grandparents' house, and when Xander goes to Scioto Hills, or if we go on vacation and the kids can't bring all their stuff, Fred always gets to come with us. And when Xander was very little, he even asked me if Fred would get to go to heaven with him someday because he just loved Fred so much, and he still does. Now the other stuffed animal I want to show you, this one belongs to Grace. And this little giraffe's name is Popcorn. And Popcorn was a gift from someone we didn't even know. We were at Milano's eating dinner when Grace was little, and there was an older man playing the claw machine that picks up the stuffed animals, and he won Grace this little giraffe, and she named it Popcorn. And ever since then, Popcorn has been Grace's special stuffed animal, and Popcorn also goes with us in the car a lot and on lots of adventures as a family. And the last one that I want to introduce you to and tell you a story about is Fisher. Fisher belongs to Lily. Lily got Fisher several years ago when we went to Bill's training camp, the football team, and he used to have a little Bill's bandana on. And Fisher is Lily's special stuffed animal, and Fisher goes everywhere with us. Fisher rides in the car with us every morning on the way to school, and Lily gets out and Fisher stays in her car seat, and then Fisher's waiting for her when she gets back from school every day in the car. And Fisher goes with us on a lot of errands too. So back in January, just Lily and I went shopping at Kroger, and Lily brought in Fisher, and she was pushing one of those little shopping carts, the tiny ones. And she had Fisher kind of like hanging over the side of it like this. And we had done most of our grocery shopping. We had picked up a gallon of milk, and Lily had noticed that they had put all the stuffed animals out for Valentine's Day. And so she wanted to go look at them. So we went over there to look at all the stuffed animals, and we were there a long time. And then it was time to go, and I had to pick up like 2 more things. So we left the stuffed animal area, and as we headed toward the checkout, Lily looked down and realized that Fisher was no longer hanging on her shopping cart. And she was super worried. And so we started to backtrack through the store, and we made all the way back to the Valentine's Day stuffed animals, and Fisher wasn't there. And she started to get very worried, and we asked one of the Kroger people working near there if they had seen a little stuffed golden retriever, and they had not. So I told Lily, I was like, let's go ask at guest services at Kroger. So it was all the way on the other side of the store and all the way up front. And I could tell the whole way that we were on our way walking up to guest services, Lily looked like she was about ready to cry. And I sort of felt like I might cry because I was so sad that Lily had lost something that was so important to her. And so we got up there and I asked them nicely if anyone had turned in a stuffed animal, and the lady smiled a really big smile, and I looked down and Lily had smiled a really big smile, and the lady went and she turned around and she pulled Fisher out from underneath the counter, and Lily gave Fisher a big hug, and all of a sudden all her tears sort of turned into happiness, and we went home and we talked about how that was so scary and how we never wanted to lose Fisher again. So I am wondering, while I was telling you all those stories, if you were sort of thinking about your favorite stuffed animal or your favorite thing. And I want you to think about how you might feel if that thing went missing, if something happened to it, it got lost or broken, or you couldn't find it anymore. I want you to think about how you would feel inside. Now, I don't have a favorite stuffed animal, but my kids are some of the most important things to me. And I know that if I ever lost them or if anything happened to them, I know how inside I would feel. I would feel worried and kind of sick to my stomach, and probably like I was gonna cry, just like Lily felt when Fisher was gone, because they are someone that I love very, very much. Now, I want you to sort of think about that feeling. And in a little while I'm telling you our story from the Bible, I'm gonna ask you to think about that feeling. Now, let's go ahead and talk about our story from the Bible. Our story from the Bible comes from the exact same book and chapter that our story last week was from. So, let's review a little bit. Our story today is from Luke 2. And in Luke 2, there are several stories. There is the story of baby Jesus being born. There is the story that we learned about last week about Jesus being dedicated at the temple, and the story of Simeon and Anna, who God kept their promises to. And the story for this week is from the end of Luke 2. It starts in verse 41. Now, before I tell you this story, I want you to remember that the last time we learned about Jesus in Luke 2, he was just a baby, probably about 5 weeks old or a month old. And that story ended with these words, and this is important, I want you to remember it. It said, "And the child grew," which means he grew taller and older, "and became strong, and he was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was on him." That's how that story ended. Now, where the Bible picks up next, Jesus is no longer a baby. Jesus is 12 years old. Now, my son is almost 12. He'll be 12 in about a month, and he's in 6th grade. So if you know someone who's 12, they're in 6th, they're 7th grade, and so kind of think of someone you know who that's age. Now, this is the picture that they gave us for the story, and I don't know if Jesus really looks 11 in that story, but there's a lot of time that goes by between baby Jesus and 12-year-old Jesus in the Bible. And the Bible doesn't really tell us anything about what happened in between Jesus being a little baby and Jesus being 12 years old, except for that he grew bigger and stronger and wiser, and that God's favor and love was on him very much. So, the next story I'm going to tell you, when Jesus is 12, there has to be something very important in it if it's in the Bible. Now, the story takes place again in Jerusalem. Now, at that time, Jesus didn't live in Jerusalem. Jesus lived in a town called Nazareth. And I have a map here. Let me hold it up. Here is Nazareth right here. And down here is Jerusalem. Now, the Bible tells us in the story, Jesus is going to have to travel with his family from Nazareth to Jerusalem. Every year, Jesus' family did this to celebrate the festival of the Passover. The Passover was the biggest holiday for Jews. Now, the Passover, if you can remember back to the Old Testament, was in the book of Exodus, when the Israelites were fleeing Egypt and Pharaoh. Remember, Pharaoh didn't want to let them go, and he sent all those horrible plagues to them. And the last plague was the worst plague because he was going to kill the firstborn of the family, even the animals. And so God told the Israelites to put blood on the top of their doorway and on the sides of their doorway. And if they did that, the death would pass over their house. Their firstborns would live. And it was that plague that finally made Pharaoh tell Moses that the people could leave Egypt and no longer be slaves and head out of Egypt toward the promised land. So that is what they're sort of remembering. The festival of Passover was a time to remember how God saved the Israelites out of the slavery of Egypt. It was the biggest holiday, sort of like Christmas is one of our biggest holidays. It was a big celebration, and it lasted for a whole week. And a lot of people would head to Jerusalem, where the temple was, to celebrate this holiday. And Jesus' family was no different. It wasn't just Jesus' family. It was like all the Jewish families in Nazareth would go. So imagine going somewhere with like a huge group of people. Maybe you've gone somewhere on vacation with like aunts and uncles and cousins, or maybe you just have some friends that their parents have a lot of kids and you've all like gone to do something together. This is how it would have been for Jesus. So a whole group of them would have packed up the food and clothes they needed for the week in a tent because they had to have somewhere to sleep. And they would have packed all those things up, and when the whole group of them would have headed from Nazareth to Jerusalem. Now the Bible tells us, and I think this is interesting, it says they head up to Jerusalem. And if you're looking at the map, you're like, Mrs. Edom, Nazareth is here, Jerusalem is here, that is down. But that's really just the direction south. In between Nazareth and Jerusalem are some huge hills and mountains, and so they actually traveled up to Jerusalem. So they had to walk up on the way there. It was a tall route, like they would get higher as they went there. So they were in Jerusalem, they had a great time, they celebrated the Passover feast with all their family and friends, and the time for the holiday ended and it was time to go home. So Mary and Joseph packed all their things back up that they had packed to take to this festival and feast, and all their friends did too and their family, and they headed back to Jerusalem. Now, to get from Nazareth to Jerusalem is about 70 miles. So sort of from where we live to go to Cincinnati, maybe a little bit farther, but not much. Now today in a car, if you had to drive there, it would take you just a little over an hour. But back in Jesus' time, they did not have cars. And so they walked or took their donkeys and their carts, and the trip took 2 or 3 days. So they would walk some, put their tents up at night, sleep, get up the next morning, walk some more until they finally got home to Nazareth. Now, so they packed all up and they start heading away from Nazareth. But remember, Jesus is 12. And so he wasn't a super little kid anymore. And so what a lot of the kids did who were that age then is they would be allowed to walk with other families. Like maybe they would walk with their cousins, or maybe they would walk with their best friend and their family, and some of the kids would all just kind of hang out together as they traveled along. Well, back then there weren't cell phones or anything like that. And so Jesus' family and all the other people they were traveling with walked from Jerusalem the whole day heading home to Nazareth. And when they got there, they probably got all their stuff out to pitch their tents and make their campfires. By then, the kids knew that it was time to head back to find your family, and they were going to set up the camp to sleep. Well, when it came time on the first day, Jesus was nowhere to be found. And Mary and Joseph went to their families, like his aunts and uncles, and said, have you seen Jesus? Was he walking with your family today? We knew we were leaving today. We saw him. Is he with you? And they said no. And so they would go to a friend's family and say, have you seen Jesus today? Did he walk with your kids? And again, no, they searched the whole camp looking for Jesus. And they couldn't find him. So they decided, as any parents would do, they packed up all their stuff and they started heading back to Jerusalem, away from the group. And so they had to walk a whole day, not knowing where Jesus was or anything. So I want you to think about the story I told you about losing something that was important to you, kind of like Lily lost Fisher. And you know what? That's exactly how Jesus' parents felt. They were worried. And when they got back to Jerusalem, they started looking around. Now, there was no TV to show a picture of Jesus around the whole town to say, has anyone seen this child? They just had to start asking people. And nobody had seen him. And the Bible tells us they searched for 3 whole days. And my guess is that with every day and every hour that went by, Mary probably got more and more worried about her missing son. Well, finally, on the 3rd day, they went back to the temple in Jerusalem, and they found Jesus sitting there, sitting among the grown-ups, talking about things, talking about the Old Testament and the laws. And everyone there who was listening to him was amazed that this boy, who was only 12 years old, knew so much about God. And the Bible tells us they were so impressed with his wisdom and what he was saying. Well, when Mary and Joseph showed up, Mary looks at him, and I love what the Bible says. He says, son. Well, first it says, when his parents saw him, they were astonished, which means they were kind of shocked. And Mary said to him, son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you. Now, if that was your mom saying that to you, can you kind of imagine how she would say it? I don't think she would say it with a happy voice. My guess is Mary was tired and she'd been worried for 3 whole days, plus the day they had walked, so probably 4 whole days, and there's her son just sitting there. Now, Jesus answers her back, and I want you to understand that when Jesus says this, he doesn't mean to be smart aleck or sound like he knows it all. He answers her in a very respectful way, but here's what he says. Why were you searching for me? He asked. Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house? Now I want you to think, who was Jesus talking about when he said his father? Was he talking about Joseph? Joseph was his earthly father. He was talking about God. He was talking about his heavenly Father. And it says, Mary and Joseph did not understand what he was saying. Now, Mary knew how important Jesus was. He knew she was God's son. He was God's son, but I don't know maybe what she didn't understand that Jesus was saying. It says, then Jesus looked at them, and in some Bibles it says he was submissive to them, and in other Bibles it says he was obedient to them. And he went with them, and they started the walk, and they went home to Nazareth. Now, I want you to think for a minute. Jesus was perfect. And so I don't think when he stayed at the temple, he meant to disobey his parents. He was just telling them that he needed to be closer to God and closer to his Father. But then it says that even though Jesus was God, and even though he was perfect, and even though he was the king of everything, he was still obedient to his earthly parents. Mary and Joseph. He knew that was the right thing to do because that's what the Bible tells children to do. And so he did what was right, what he knew he should do, and he went with them home to Nazareth. And then the Bible says exactly what it said before when Jesus was a baby. It says, and Jesus grew in wisdom and stature, that means he got taller, and in favor with God and man, which means men and other people loved Jesus as well as God was pleased with Jesus. And that is the last story we have of Jesus' childhood growing up. Boys and girls, I want to go ahead and I want to review our verse today with you. Now, on our verse today, I have covered up some words, and I want you to see if you can fill in the words. It says, in the beginning was the blank, and the blank was with God, and the blank was God. He was in the beginning with God. All right, now let's try to say the verse, and I'm going to take off the sticky notes. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Oops. He, meaning Jesus, was with God in the beginning. Our big picture question for this unit is Jesus God or a human? And we know that as the Son of God, Jesus is both fully God and fully human. And our story today about Jesus obeying his parents and coming with them, and how Mary and Joseph felt scared that they had lost their son, is a story that helps teach us and remind us that even though Jesus was full of wisdom and loved God very much, he was also human, and he had to obey his parents too, just like we have to obey your parents. All right, I love you. I hope you guys have a great week. I will show you the secret about my dining room. Okay, here's the secret. So at my house, we don't call it the dining room. Hold on, I can move this. We call it, oh, there's my real puppy. We call it the Lego room, because at our house, most of the time, this whole table, I had to move stuff so it's a little messy. The whole table is covered with Legos, and the kids playing here. Right now, it's Heart Lake City Lego Friends. So we just call it the Lego room. We don't even really call it the dining room at our house. All right, I hope you guys have a wonderful week. I'll see you later. Bye.